Hello, I'm Rupert Sheldrake, and this is another of the Sheldrake-Vernon Dialogues, and I'm here with Mark Vernon.
Hi there, Rupert. Lovely to join you once again. I think like the 98th conversation we've had now.
Wonderful. Well, Mark, anyone who's looking at you now will see beside you a picture of the cover of your book, Awake. And indeed, I've got a copy right here. Um, and the subtitle, William Blake and the Power of the Imagination. Um, I'd love to talk about the imagination because this was a hugely important part of Blake's work. And it's something you dwell on in the book. And what Blake means by the imagination is not just a kind of fantasy, it's something much deeper and more interesting. So I wonder if first you could say something about that and Blake's view of the imagination.
Yeah, well, look, thanks for picking that up. And I, of course, would be delighted to talk about it. And it's very relevant actually to some of our most recent conversations where we've been thinking about principles in nature. And whilst, as you say, many people might assume that nowadays imagination is a kind of private capacity that individuals have, perhaps related somehow to the idea that consciousness is a byproduct of the activity of the brain. So a very kind of contracted notion of the imagination. Um, William Blake very much resisted that understanding. It was born in his time, in fact. Figures like John Locke, Adam Smith, David Hume, they were all contracting the notion of the imagination into, more or less a widespread assumption now anyway. Maybe the dominant one, you'll know more about this than me, but that somehow consciousness, imagination, all that kind of psychic activity springs from somewhere within the skull, perhaps related to the body in some way. Anyway, Blake and others at his time immediately resist that. And it's related to nature too, because one of Blake's sort of favorite utterances on the imagination is when he says, nature is imagination itself. And to Blake, when he looked out into the natural world, he saw myriad manifestations of a divine imaginative activity that was part and parcel of the same divine imaginative activity going on in his own creativity. With his, not just with his poetry and his painting and so on, the obvious signs of that. But he said that even the way we perceive the world is a product of the imaginative, I don't know, sort of spectrum, you might say, that we bring to that. And his great criticism of post-Newtonian science. Newton was the figure that he used to capture this sense of a contracted imagination. His critique of it wasn't that there was no imagination in modern science. I mean, that clearly is not the case. There's huge imagination in even a materialist science. And in fact, Blake would say it takes a fantastic imagination to believe that the world of living vitalities all around us, which clearly have a kind of interiority as much as an exteriority, to come to the point of being convinced that the materialistic worldview is the true description of that is a fantastically imaginative achievement. Is just that it's an achievement that has lost the heart of it in his mind. So he talks about single vision and Newton's sleep, and what Blake and others, particularly figures like Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, but then especially I think in Germany, figures like Goethe, who's more or less contemporary with Blake. This romantic tradition, you might say, of science is born at the same time. And one of the key elements within that is that when we engage with the wider world, the reason why we can do it, the reason why we can say and describe anything about the wider world, be that in a scientific context or any other, is because we're participating in the wider world, that our imagination is part of the divine and imagination of the world, that our intelligence fits the intelligence of the wider world. And so it's a much more satisfying as well as enriching understanding of the imagination, science, the world as we actually see it and experience it, with all this interior life as well. So maybe that's the sort of starter for 10, in terms of just to give some indication as to how far-reaching this notion of imagination is. And as you're saying, it's not just a little nice to have for those who are creatively inclined. It's absolutely woven into the warp and weft of our experience and engagement with life.
Yes. The one question that comes to my mind is how this differs from a more traditional view, like in Platonism or Neoplatonism. Plato has a world of ideas, which is in a kind of realm, a conscious intellectual realm beyond nature, a transcendent realm. And then this world of ideas is reflected in the natural world. Everything in nature reflects what's in the world of forms or ideas. And then in someone like Aquinas in the Middle Ages, the idea that our minds can understand nature because they come from a common source, namely divine consciousness, is the source both of our minds and of nature, and therefore there's a kind of relationship between them because they have a common origin and common patterns. Now, in the sense that Blake's ideas seem to lie in that tradition, but by using the word imagination rather than forms or ideas, it sounds more dynamic, it sounds more moving and alive, whereas it's the world of Platonic forms or ideas, transcendent forms and ideas, perhaps wrongly, but it suggests the idea of something more static. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think actually this is part of the criticism that's required for how Platonism has come to be viewed myself. We've talked about this before, and my PhD was on one of Plato's dialogues, and I didn't quite realize it at the time, but what I was partly engaging with there was, I think, a reduced and even introduced notion of Platonism, because words like, intellect, for example, before the modern period, implied a dynamism. The intellectus in Latin was very different from the ratio in Latin. The ratio was much more like our modern understanding of intellect, as if it's really based on kind of fixed patterns, logical connections, that kind of approach. Whereas the intellectus was this living dynamism. It's much more like the sort of practical wisdom, you might say. If I know how to, I don't know, ride a bike, you could say that I have a kind of wisdom about riding the bike that's as much felt in my body and is responsive and adaptive to the continuingly changing conditions of the road. And so phronesis, for example, in Greek, means much more that responsive engagement, that participative sharing. And so the idea that things are either transcendent or immanent doesn't really exist in Plato. When, I don't know, it even gets lost in translation. So one of Plato's famous myths to describe a kind of awakening sense of things is the myth of the cave. And this then also gets described with famously, it's sometimes even called Diotima's ladder of ascent in the Symposium. But the word ladder is not actually in Diotima. It's as much a going into as it's a going above. And I think that's the same in the myth of the cave too, because whilst the Socratic figure in the story sort of leaves the cave, they then also return and see then the truth of the life in the cave. The Republic, where that's described, famously begins with the words, "As I went down." And Plato's dialogues, always the opening phrase is really the key dynamic that Plato's trying to get across. And so it's by going in that you discover the transcendent as much as by standing back or going above. And this is very explicit in Blake as well. I mean, one of his best known phrases is to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. And that's precisely by saying that immanence and transcendence come together. And I think that what was the medieval and then even the Greek notion of idea or intellectus, he uses the word imagination precisely to re-stress this dynamic, participative quality that, you're right, does get lost in the modern way that the word form or idea is used. I mean, this again is, I think you can trace it directly to Francis Bacon. And like Newton, Bacon is also one of Blake's key kind of bête noirs. I mean, both Newton and Bacon are actually more complicated figures. I think we've even talked before about Bacon's vitalism.
Mm.
He felt that matter has a kind of interiority that can move itself. But nonetheless, this idea that ideas are laws is a move that Bacon makes, and it becomes very powerful because it becomes tractable. So you can turn the dynamism of nature, at least a certain aspect of it, into mathematical equations that then mean you can build abstractions based on the equations, which we call technology, where as a way you can control the variables to make things that have huge power determined by human will. And that's the world we live in now. And part of what Blake was pushing against too was precisely that, the idea that the world is a kind of great machine, that if human beings are clever enough, they can manipulate more and more fully, rather than a much more relational, dynamic unfolding, which human beings have a huge part to play in. I mean, I think Blake thought there was even an exceptional role that human beings have to play in that unfolding. It's still very much an active part we have to play, but it's co-creative rather than purely manipulative. So that's the direction of travel that Blake wants to have us go in as well, if that makes any sense to you.
Yes, well, it does. It's more a kind of a more alive view of a Platonic or Neoplatonic tradition, made more alive by using this language and also stressing creativity. Because after all, Newtonian physics doesn't stress creativity. As you say, it says, the fixed laws were all fixed there at the very beginning, and they've been the same ever since. And the only thing that gives change there is energy, which is sort of movement or momentum and things like that. It's not within the laws. The laws don't change. And of course, Blake was, as you point out in your book, writing before the theory of evolution. So he wasn't an evolutionary thinker. Although I was fascinated that he did the illustrations for Erasmus Darwin's book, The Botanic Garden. I'm Darwin's grandfather, who was, in fact, a precursor of the idea of evolution, who had this evolutionary vision. But then when it comes to human creativity, this is a long-standing debate as to how it happens. Is everything that can possibly happen already there in the divine imagination? An idea that Bergson was fighting against, the idea that creativity is nothing but a dusting off of some pre-existing archetype that's always been there and always will be there. And it's just manifested when the time is ripe. Which means that creativity isn't really creativity at all. It's simply the manifestation of something that's always been there, or beyond time, as opposed to Bergson's emphasis on the evolution involves creativity, making things up as it goes along. There's a kind of creative response to what's happening. It's a much more active principle. Now, Blake's writing makes imagination sound active. But then I wonder how he thought imagination works. I mean, human creativity may be a kind of co-creation, but then how's the creativity going on in the realm of the imagination? Is it all already there, or is it being generated in response to what happens in the world, and a creative process actually happening now rather than at the beginning or beyond time?
And I think that it's a very rich area, and it's as much a theological area as anything, actually. So just to say that Blake was very much against the deism of the times, which still had an idea of God, but it was God as a divine engineer who sort of set the laws, tweaked the dials, and then off as it were, the creation went. And Blake is he's so strongly against that idea. He says that deists, which was sort of the dominant theme at the time, really, and he says the deists are enemies of the human race, which is, really strong language. But what he's saying is that worldview precisely, directly or indirectly works to destroy our humanity because it takes away this soulful vitality. And you mentioned energy there. Blake says energy is life itself. And energy for him isn't just this kind of neutral ball that can do work, which is the Newtonian way of describing energy, defining energy. But energy implicitly has a kind of telos, has a kind of striving, which would be shaped by the Platonic notion of the good, the beautiful, and the true. But this brings back to your question, and I don't know quite how Bergson would respond to this, but I think you need to bring in an idea of the infinite here, or the eternal, which are very key ideas in Blake as well. Another famous phrase of his is, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite. He doesn't just say varied or myriad or continually evolving or unfolding in ever new ways. He uses the word infinite. And I think the point about the infinite is it's the divine space. And whilst we human beings who, have expansive but nonetheless finite capacities, can experience the infinite, as it were, as a continual unfolding, and including novelty. I think in the infinite itself, in the divine world itself, that what seem to impossible things actually come together. It's a kind of union of opposites, a contrary, as Blake would say. And that is that there can't be anything outside of the being of God, because being itself is divine. To exist is in some way to share in the divine nature. But in the infinite space, rather than from the finite vantage that we have, that continual expansive presence can also be a continual expansive unfolding. There can be an ever continuing novelty in the infinite, even as there's a sort of dynamism, and even as it always already exists in the divine life. And this was actually an ancient idea amongst the church fathers. I mean, Gregory of Nyssa is one of the best figures known for it now. And personally, I think Blake actually knew work from the church fathers, because his mother was a Moravian, and Moravians took their authority from the orthodoxy, not from Protestant or Catholic churches. And every so often he uses a phrase which is essentially a direct lift from a church father. Perhaps the best known is when he describes Christianity by saying, therefore God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. And that's a kind of like rings like a bell across the church fathers. And I think he knew the Gregory of Nyssa notion, which is that to journey into God is never ending. It's because it's constantly this never ending expansion, which includes novelty. It's not just, as it were, a kind of unfolding, because within the nature of divine creativity is novelty. The two, as it were, what seem like contraries come together. There wouldn't be real creativity without novelty. As you say, that it would just be a sort of a playing of what already existed. So I think that to cut to the chase, I hope that makes some sense. But I think what Blake's challenging us to do is to realize that when we're contemplating the divine, we're contemplating that which we both know, but also that which we sort of don't know, which is part of the thrill of it. It takes us to this edge where we sort of half have got it and half haven't. And for me, when in certain trains of thought now, when people reject the Platonic, for example, because they think it can't have the novel, what that risks doing is reducing the divine creativity to a human understanding that we can get, that we feel happy with, that sort of feels like, no, that must be right. But you risk losing the divine then, because the whole point of a divine presence is that it takes you out and beyond that which you can grasp, as well as inviting you into it to participate in it.
In that sense, then, Blake's ideas, although they predate the idea of Darwinian evolution, or at least Charles Darwinian evolution, and they predate the evolutionary cosmology that we now have, are perfectly compatible with it because they leave this large role for creativity, which
Yeah,
is
and he himself has a sense of things evolving and changing. He talks often about the seven ages, and he was very clear that the Christian moment is a new moment. He often contrasts that with the Druids, and that doesn't go down so well now because we understand that Druids didn't practice human sacrifice, for example, which it was thought did occur in the 18th century. But the point for our conversation is that he definitely has a sense of different periods, different ages of man, if you like. So it's not a Darwinistic kind of theory, but it is a sense that there's a distant time and things were very different in the past.
he famously talked about angels and obviously saw them as part of the cosmic order. What role did they play in creativity? I mean, they're spirit beings. They're often thought of as intelligences within nature. So how did he see their role in all this?
Yeah, I mean, for someone who I think saw angels probably every day, because they were just part and parcel of his perception of things. When you tune into the interiority of all things, um, things become dynamic quite spontaneously. And I think Blake was one of those people that just was able to take that extra step, of seeing not just a kind of impersonal dynamism, but a personal quality in all things. And so I think that the notion of a hierarchy of angels, which just means that angels are kind of enfolded in on each other, that there might be, the angel that's the guardian angel for me and for you, but then there's angels of place, and then there's angels of the cosmos and angels of the skies and so on. So it's a kind of nestled or tiered kind of notion rather than just like a ladder hierarchical notion. Um, so I think that he saw. Um, Having said that, this what I wanted to get to was having said that this, very rich, kind of vital, dynamic sort of perception of things. He's also quite strangely, um, uh, I don't know quite what the word is, pedestrian in the way that he describes angels. Maybe that's what it's like. If this is part and parcel of your everyday experience and not some peak moment of revelation, it starts to get a bit more ordinary. And Dante does the same, actually. Angels often seem very focused, very kind of mission orientated. They arrive, they do their thing, and then they kind of depart, leaving human beings feeling a bit discombobulated. What was that? What did I just sort of half sense? And I think that that is a difference between us and angels, is that um, angels' creativity is to deliver from the divine creativity. Whereas I think human beings, we have a freedom here that we can align or disalign, we can harmonize or resist the divine creativity. And this is deep actually in a lot of spiritual traditions, that human beings are different from angels. We have a very similar kind of intelligence, but we have a kind of freedom, whereas the angels do the divine will directly. And I mean, in one of the stories I like that I think persuades this very vividly is from Islam, actually, and Iblis, who is a sort of semi-satanic figure in Islam. Um, the reason why Iblis was sort of cast out was because when God made human beings, God said to Iblis, "You must bow down before human beings," and because they have this new quality called freedom. And Iblis said, "No, I won't bow down to any creature apart from you, God." So for very sort of strong, pious, good reasons, Iblis didn't bow down to human beings. But that meant that Iblis didn't recognize part of the divine creativity, didn't recognize the divine infinity. And so, as it were, cast himself almost away from the fullness of the divine vision. and so becomes this kind of fallen, certainly semi kind of satanic figure in the Islamic cosmology. So human beings, again, we're quite distinctive, certainly from the angels, that we're we're divine too, but we carry this freedom that certainly the angels don't. Maybe there's a parallel here with a kind of science that both wants things that are not fixed, but can be expressed. But nonetheless, that's in a kind of polar relationship with that which is changing and unfolding and shifting and so on. You need both, I think, to have a science. You need to be able to say some things, but also be open to new things. But look, this is something you've engaged with very, very deeply indeed. So I wonder whether that is making sense to you.
Well, yes. But I'd like to just back up a little bit because you mentioned Islam and angels, that imagination is a very important part of some Sufi theories, like in Ibn Arabi, a great Sufi thinker. And there, the divine imagination, or the imaginal realm, is a major part of their understanding. So I wonder if you could say something about the relation between these views we've been talking about and Sufi conceptions of the imagination and the divine.
Yeah, well, certainly I think that Ibn Arabi's notion of the imagination is very close to Blake's. It's just possible that Blake knew of Ibn Arabi, and the route would be that Ibn Arabi is directly influential on Dante and the Divine Comedy. I mean, to such an extent that there's in Ibn Arabi's hands drawings of Mount Purgatory as well as the Inferno that correspond to Dante's schema. And Blake, of course, deeply engaged with the Divine Comedy, illustrated the Divine Comedy in the last part of his life, learned medieval Italian in order to do so. But in the milieu of Georgian London, which was the centre of the British Empire, particularly connected through the East India Company with the Indian subcontinent, whilst there's no tangible, like written evidence, a text or something with Blake's hand on it, it's very likely, I think, that Blake would have not just had contact with Islamic figures who definitely would have come to London, and moreover, they might well have been Sufis, because Sufism is often associated with the civil service. And so a Sufi would have reason to come to the heart of the empire. You can quite easily build up a fairly convincing picture that would connect the dots. So I think that it's wholly plausible for someone who stressed the imagination so much that they would have picked up from their encounter with Sufi Islam. But yeah, I mean, and Ibn Arabi can make very, very strong statements about the imagination. Like, in the imagination, there is no error. Ibn Arabi will say. And to us who are used to the idea of fantasy and so on, you think, how can that possibly be? But again, in Ibn Arabi, this relates to the infinity of God. And so one of the beautiful, I think, sections of Ibn Arabi's massive spirituality, but it talks about journeying to God. And if we journey to God through the imagination, through the perception, Ibn Arabi will say, even when we're turning away from the divine, even when we're caught in our own fantasy, if you like, we're still strangely engaged in discovering the extraordinary extent of God. And there's nowhere that God is not. And even in the darkness, even in distress and so on, somehow that is still part of the divine presence. And it tests us, and we don't know how. But I think it's that extent of the reach of the divine that, of course, is very strong in Islam, and that Ibn Arabi is remembering when he says, there's no error in the imagination.
One thing that reading your reflections on Blake and the imagination stimulated in me was reminding me of the philosophy of E. Douglas Fawcett. I don't know if you've come across it.
I don't know. So do say, yeah.
E. Douglas Fawcett is author of this book, The World as Imagination, published in 1916, and
Fantastic. That's one to add to my list.
and he followed it up with another book called Divine Imagining. And E. Douglas Fawcett was the older brother of Colonel Fawcett, Percy Fawcett, the Amazonian explorer, who disappeared in the Amazon. And he was a mountaineer, and he also wrote some dialogues, the Zermatt dialogues, of some sort of Cambridge types on a alpine expedition, sitting around talking about philosophy in the evenings. He was an extremely original thinker, and in The World's Imagination, he makes the case that the world is in fact a reflection of imagination, and divine imagining, the nature of God is imagination. And in this book, he actually says that this may not be the only universe. He actually uses the word multiverse, and thinks of the divine imagination as the ultimate reality from which all worlds come. There are many universes, because the divine imagination is limitless or maybe infinite. And that each universe, he reserves the word God for the God of each particular universe. So who we call God is the God of our universe. But the divine imagining goes beyond the God of this universe. In that sense, it's perhaps a bit like Eckhart's view of the Godhead, which goes beyond any conception we can think of God, or even God as a Holy Trinity. There's something beyond that. But anyway, this is, I think, he's a very remarkable philosopher, and it's clearly written and hardly known today. The fact you don't know about him is, to me, a proof that he's hardly known.
Well, thank you for that. That's sort of, kind of a compliment. No, but it's very interesting just to gloss what you're saying there about Eckhart and the Godhead, and because in Blake, the divine figure that is most obvious and present is Jesus. He's very clearly Christian there, although immediately you should say it's a porous Jesus. It's Jesus who, I think, wasn't just influenced by Islam, but we know Blake was influenced too by Hindu ideas, for example. He was one of the first readers of the Bhagavad Gita, and I think that deeply helped him to understand the significance of the figure of Christ. But the spirit is there. The dynamic principle is either implicit or explicit, of course. But even I think you can say that Blake had a notion of the Godhead, because the Father is mentioned on occasion. Blake will occasionally say, "I heard the Father speak to me," but it's much more a presence that is like a kind of aboriginal source or wellspring, almost sort of beyond envisioning, even beyond the imagination, but somehow the source of the imagination too. Like the relationship between the Father and the Son in Trinitarian theology. So that's very resonant, actually. I shall definitely have to turn to that.
Well, it's a very rich theme, and I think that when Fawcett was writing, it was completely out of fashion. He was writing on, after the First World War, when mechanistic materialism became so dominant in the intellectual world. It was already very influential, but there was still a kind of hangover of idealism from the 19th century, and I think that was one thing that influenced him. Probably also Indian philosophy. Well, it's a very rich theme. I think we've more or less run out of time, but I thank you very much, Mark, for saying more about the imagination from your excellent book. I really do think this book certainly changed my idea of Blake, and shows how relevant his ideas are today, because in many ways he was far ahead of his time. And
I think that Blake, he has a spiritual inner imaginative analysis, because he sees coming what has now very much manifested, not least of which is the mechanical imagination. But by going back, as it were, to the roots of that a couple of hundred years ago, you can sort of see what's happened. But that, of course, brings a freedom to be able to see things differently. And then I do hope bridging figures like Bergson and so on. So I'm encouraged that at least makes some sense to you.
Good. Well, thank you.